Hi, this is Ken of Rist Innovations. This is part 3 of a 6-part series on the table saw. In this video, we'll cover how to properly set up your table saw. We'll cover types of blades, alignment, riving knives, blade guards, blade height, and types of table saws. So let's get started.
First, make sure your saw is unplugged before performing any visual inspection or changing the blade. Also, make sure that the saw is free of clutter as well as the surrounding floor. For long and large pieces, it's important to have support both in the front of the saw as well as the outfeed portion of the saw. Let's talk saw blades. This is a side-by-side shot of the most common saw blades that you'll see in the shop. The general purpose, the combination, the finish, and the rip. I'll show a table showing the best applications to use each of these, as well as some close-up shots of what the teeth look like. This is the general purpose blade, and this has 40 teeth, and they have an alternate top bevel. So each tooth, you can see, alternates from one to the next, the angle of the bevel. This is a close-up of the combination blade. This has 50 teeth, 40 like the alternate top bevel from the general purpose blade, and then 10 teeth that are flat chisels. This is a close-up of the finished blade. This has 80 teeth. They're the alternate top bevel, just like the general purpose blade. Only the difference is there's twice as many teeth on this as there are in the general purpose blade. This is a close-up of the rip blade, and this only has 24 teeth. This one in particular, the tooth design is of the flat chisel. Okay, now let's talk about the best application for each of the saw blades. The rip blade by far is the best blade for ripping, especially thick wood, because it is designed for that exact purpose. The large gullets are able to easily remove large amounts of wood chips. The rip blade is not recommended for cross-cutting, especially if you're looking for a fine finish. The general purpose and the combination blades are good all-around blades for both ripping and cross-cutting wood. I find them the best blades for most of my table saw cuts. The finished blade is the best choice for cutting plywood and for cross-cutting wood if you're looking for a fine finish due to the large number of teeth. Thin kerf versus full kerf 10-inch blades. The kerf is the amount of material that the blade removes from your workpiece when you're cutting through it. For a full kerf blade, it's 1/8 of an inch wide, and for a thin kerf blade, it's 3/32 of an inch wide. Full kerf blades require more horsepower to cut since they remove more material than the thin kerf blades, but they aren't as affected by heat and lateral stress as the thin kerf blades. Since the thin kerf blades require less horsepower, they tend to help underpowered table saws. I want to emphasize to make sure that you use the correctly sized riving knife that is designed for the specific blade thickness you are using. Let's go into more details on kerf sizes and riving knife sizes. My full kerf finished blade measures 120 thousandths, and the matching riving knife splitter measures 102 thousandths, so the splitter is 18 thousandths of an inch smaller. My thin kerf finished blade measures 86 thousandths, and my matching riving knife splitter measures 85 thousandths, so the splitter is only 1 thousandth smaller. It is interesting to note that I measured the kerf in the test workpiece to be 91 thousandths, which is 5 thousandths wider than the blade. This is due to the vibration that thin kerf blades tend to exhibit, since they are not as rigid as full kerf blades. I purchased my riving knife splitters from Shark Guard, and they offer 3 different thicknesses of splitters: 120 thousandths, 105 thousandths, and 90 thousandths of an inch. They recommended that I measure my blades and the kerfs they produce before I purchased my splitters, and I'm glad I did, because if I had ordered the 120 thousandth splitter, it would have been too thick for my brand new full kerf finish blade. It can be dangerous to use too thick of a splitter for the specific blade you have. So for instance, here's an example of what happens when I try to push a workpiece that has a thin kerf cut past a full kerf splitter. The full kerf splitter is too thick and it causes the workpiece to bind and prevents the workpiece from moving safely. If you have any questions regarding your specific blades versus splitters, I recommend that you contact your table saw manufacturer. Shark Guard is another valuable source, and they can make riving knives, splitters, and blade guards for many different brands of saws.
Tell me more, saw blade man.
Okay, I will.
Let's finish making a zero clearance throat plate. I purchased this from Shark Guard, where I bought my blade guard. First, I'm leveling the throat plate with the adjustment screws. Next, I moved my fence to secure the throat plate in the saw and then attached a strong magnet to secure the other portion of the plate. Then I raised the blade into the throat plate to cut the slot. Next, I cut the slot longer with my jigsaw so the riving knife splitter would fit. The zero clearance throat plate will minimize tear out and prevent thin pieces from getting wedged between the throat plate and the blade. All right, we're going to check the alignment of the blade to the miter slot using this alignment gauge. So I've made a mark for an individual tooth right here. I'm going to zero out the gauge. I'm going to rotate the blade until the mark is down here, slide the gauge down, take another reading, and as long as I'm plus or minus 5/1000ths of an inch, we're good to go. Minus 5/1000ths of an inch, we're good. Okay, now let's check the alignment of the fence to the miter slot. So I've just rotated the alignment gauge and I have it touching the fence right now, and I've zeroed it out. So now I'm just going to slide it down to the other end of the table. And right now I'm reading about 3.5 thousandths out, so this is perfect. Okay, let's talk riving knives, splitters, and blade guards. Now, for my vintage Delta Unisaw, it came with a combo splitter and blade guard. The problem with this design is that it was very difficult to mount and unmount from the table. There was a bolt down inside there and then a rod in the back, and it was very awkward. So I, like many people, didn't use it. But I did know the importance of having a splitter. So I bought this aftermarket splitter from Biesmeyer, and with this tooling, it was mounted down inside there of the tool, and then this would slip down, and it was a quick disconnect to remove it. The problem is that it was stationary, so you couldn't adjust the distance, and this distance between the back of the blade and the splitter was really too much. So I eventually made a series of homemade splitters. Here's an example of one here for instance, a 3/4 inch thickness plywood that I would use to cut. And the distance is much shorter now. However, I eventually knew that I needed to try to figure out a way to have that added protection of using a blade guard. And that's when I ran across this company called Shark Guard. They make a variety of blade guards and riving knives for many different manufacturers of table saws. So let me just quickly show you how easy this is to install. The other benefit, just to quickly mention, is they provide two different thicknesses of riving knives, which are important. This is for the full kerf, and then I have one for the thin kerf blades. So I have the tooling already down inside here, and this just slips down inside. Have to coax a little washer here. This is the zero clearance throat plate that we made yesterday. Drops down. Then you mount this tooling on top. And then the blade guard just slips over this down, and you're all set. The other advantage is it has a port here that you can attach a dust collector hose to, and this particular design even has a flashlight, so it's easier to see the blade when you're pushing your workpiece through. Speaking of blade guards, you should always use a blade guard whenever possible. Some designs, the riving knives are separate from the blade guard. In that case, you might consider upgrading your saw to install one of those overhead blade guards because they make it easier to move out of the way when you need to. The most important thing about the blade guard is it offers a level of protection between you and the spinning blade. And so if there was a kickback or if you inadvertently got too close to the blade, this would prevent you from having a serious injury. The other thing it offers is that it prevents chips and debris from being thrown back at you. And then lastly, it offers dust collection, in this case here as I'm showing, and that's another benefit. So now let's talk about some of the excuses that I've read for why people don't use blade guards, riving knives, or splitters. Number one, if the board warps, I will just shut the saw off. Well, kickback can happen in less than a second, and you will never be able to shut the saw off in time. Number two, I can't see the cut, so I don't use a blade guard. Well, the most important thing is to make sure that the part, your workpiece, is always up against the fence, and that's where you should be focusing your attention. Also, they do make aftermarket guards that have improved visibility. Number three, the blade guard is a hassle to put on or take off. I agree, some very old designed blade guards have been a hassle. So consider upgrading to an aftermarket blade guard that's much more user-friendly. The next one, the blade guard traps small pieces and narrow strips. I recommend to design a crosscut sled with protection. Also, the important thing is to use the blade guard for all other types of cuts whenever possible. Next one, I've been using a saw without a blade guard or riving knife for over 20 years without an issue. Well, your past does not predict your future. The average age of someone that's injured on a table saw is 50 years old, and 40% of the injuries were from people who had over 10 years of experience. So, bottom line is, it's really much safer to be able to use the riving knife / splitter and blade guard for your added protection. Let's talk blade height. Most people recommend that the blade height should be set somewhere between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch above the workpiece. Other sources recommend that the bottom of the blade gullet be exposed. Personally, I haven't seen a major difference here, and I tend to be on the conservative side, so I minimize the amount of blade that's protruding above the workpiece. Now, there's another camp that talks about going in the other extreme and raising the blade as high as possible. Let's compare the two different scenarios. So, in the case of when the blade is lower, there are more teeth making contact in the wood and that they're at a lower angle. And the opposite is the case when the blade is raised higher. When the blade is lower, the aggressiveness of the cut is much less than when the blade is raised high. And therefore, the workpiece feed rate is slower when the blade is lower versus when it is raised very high. So what are the results? When the blade is lower, there is more friction and heat generated, so there can be the possibility of more burn marks. And there are less blade marks tear out when the blade is lower. The opposite is the case when the blade is very high. There's less friction, so there's not as much chance for burning. And there are more blade marks and there is more tear out. And if you're not using a blade guard, you are really taking a chance because of the amount of blade that would be exposed above the workpiece. So the bottom line is it's up to you to make the decision on what you're comfortable with. From my perspective, again, I always try to keep the blade exposure at a minimum and whenever possible to use my blade guard for that added protection. Let's talk about types of table saws. This is a very brief overview. I could devote an entire video on the types of table saws, but for now, I will just cover some of the basics. The compact table saw is the smallest table saw, both in size and motor horsepower, and it's portable. Price ranges from a couple $100s to $900.
Their capacity is limited, and some of their features, such as the fences, are not always that reliable. The next step up is the job site saw, which has a larger capacity and larger horsepower. They are also considered portable. They typically have higher quality components than the compact saws, and their prices can range from $600 to approximately $1,600. The next step up is the contractor table saw, and this has a larger capacity and horsepower than the job site or compact saws. They tend to have higher quality components, especially their fences, and I would consider them to be stationary due to their weight. Their price ranges can be somewhere between $700 and $2,000. The cabinet saw is the largest table saw in both capacity and horsepower. They tend to have the highest quality components, especially their fences, and they are typically used in professional shops and serious hobbyist shops. They can be very pricey though, ranging in the $2,600 to over $4,000 price range. I would be remiss if I didn't at least comment on the SawStop brand table saws. They have this flesh sensing technology that will prevent you from being hurt if you were ever to come in contact with the spinning blade. They won't prevent kickback, so you still need to use the same caution you would use for any table saw, but they will prevent you from losing your finger. With that said, they aren't cheap. However, they are the only table saw manufacturer that I'm aware of that offers table saws in all four categories. And with their flesh sensing technology, I would recommend that you, if you are planning to buy a table saw, that you would at least consider the SawStop. And just to clarify, I have no affiliation with SawStop in any way. This is just my opinion.
Since you've made it this far in the video, I hope that you've enjoyed it. And if you have, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to my channel. And if you haven't seen the previous videos of this series, you can find their links below. In my next video, I will cover how to safely operate your table saw. So I'll address push sticks, rectangle of doom, safe techniques, and what not to do. So please click my link.